My name is Rachel, and I never imagined I'd be writing this kind of story for anyone to see. I'm 32 years old, a single mother to my 10-year-old son Robbie, and until recently, I had a sister. Her name is Felicia, and we used to be as close as two people could be, at least in my memories. Looking back, I see how much resentment she held, but I kept overlooking warning signs because I believed in family. We grew up in a comfortable home with our father, who tried to give us both equal opportunities. Despite that, Felicia always suspected he favored me, though I never saw evidence of any special treatment. Over the years, minor jealousy turned into passive-aggressive comments, mostly about how I was taking advantage of Dad's generosity. But nothing prepared me for the day she used my son as her pawn in twisted revenge. It all happened at Felicia's house, during her daughter's birthday party, a celebration meant to bring our families together. Robbie wasn't feeling well that morning, but he insisted on going because he adores his cousin, Lily. He has mild asthma and was on the tail end of a cold, so I made sure he had his inhaler. Felicia seemed fine at first, greeting us with a forced but polite smile, her arms crossed like she couldn't relax. I chalked it up to stress, so I tried helping in the kitchen. But every time I offered, she brushed me off, muttering something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch. I noticed Robbie looked pale, so I asked if there was a quiet spot for him to rest while the kids played. Felicia said her basement had a couch, so I led Robbie downstairs, never suspecting she'd turn off the heat. The basement itself was mostly finished, but there was a distinct chill in the air, which I assumed was normal. I helped Robbie lie down, pulled a blanket over him, and told him I'd bring him a warm drink soon. After about 15 minutes, I came back with some tea, only to find the basement door locked from the outside. I jiggled the handle, knocked, and called Robbie's name, panic building when I realized he was trapped behind it. I shouted for Felicia or anyone nearby, but the music upstairs drowned me out, and nobody seemed to hear. When I finally heard footsteps, it was Felicia, acting annoyed, saying she must have accidentally locked it after checking laundry. She opened the door, and I found Robbie shivering, teeth chattering, the basement feeling colder than before. Later, I learned she'd cut the heat to that level deliberately, to make a point. As soon as I got Robbie upstairs, I noticed how flushed and short of breath he was, his inhaler helping. Felicia offered no apology, rolled her eyes, and claimed I was overreacting, as though she hadn't trapped him. I was furious, but my main concern was Robbie's health, so I grabbed our coats and said we were leaving. That's when Felicia decided to unleash her anger, accusing me of always stealing the spotlight and using Dad's money. She spat out that locking Robbie in the basement was a wake-up call for me to stop mooching off everyone. At that point, my voice shook with rage as I told her she'd crossed the line, nearly endangering Robbie's life. Her husband, Greg, walked in on our argument, and the moment he heard what happened, I saw him turn pale. I stormed out with Robbie, but Greg followed, apologizing, promising he'd handle Felicia. Once I got Robbie home, I gave him his medication and let him rest while I seethed, replaying Felicia's words. It wasn't just sibling rivalry anymore. She had targeted my child, risking his health to teach me a lesson. I called Dad that evening, furious, and let everything spill out, from the locked door to Felicia's mocking justifications. He listened in stunned silence, then assured me he'd take immediate action, insisting Felicia had finally gone too far. Dad's always been patient with her, hoping she'd mature, but that patience evaporated the moment she endangered his grandson. A few hours later, Greg texted me, asking if Robbie was all right and whether I needed anything. He confessed he'd found the thermostat switch in the basement turned off and an electric heater cord ripped out. Greg said he was seeing a darker side of Felicia he'd overlooked for years, and he felt horrified. The next day, Dad drove to Felicia's place, demanding an explanation for her behavior, and he didn't mince words. Felicia doubled down, calling me a freeloader and accusing Dad of always taking my side, the golden child. According to Dad, she didn't show a shred of remorse for jeopardizing Robbie's safety. She insisted I was overdramatic. That conversation ended with Dad informing her that he was revising his estate plans immediately, cutting her out of the trust. She erupted, accusing him of emotional blackmail, but Dad walked out, leaving her screaming after him in a rage. When Dad called me later, his voice trembled with anger, but he sounded resolute, determined to protect Robbie and me. He said if Felicia wanted to sabotage our family, then she could do it without a penny from him. I didn't protest because I cared deeply about Robbie's safety, making sure Felicia suffered consequences. I never intended to forgive her, and I wanted a form of justice that hurt her long term. Knowing Dad had cut her off financially was a relief, but I still felt she deserved more consequences for endangering Robbie. So I spoke with Greg, who was struggling to process Felicia's malice, especially toward an innocent child. He told me Felicia had never been particularly warm, but he never imagined she could stoop to this level. Greg admitted that he worried about their own daughter, Lily, being influenced by Felicia's spiteful behavior, so he took steps. He decided Felicia would have limited access to Lily, insisting any visits be supervised because he no longer trusted her judgment. When Felicia realized Greg was siding with me and Dad, she lost it, accusing him of betrayal and threatening divorce. Greg stood firm, saying she had crossed a line and he would protect Lily. I wanted to nail Felicia in a way she'd feel for years, and that's when I remembered her shaky finances. She relied heavily on Dad's trust fund, especially to maintain the lifestyle she flaunted in front of others. Without that money, she'd be forced to downsize, which she hated, given her obsession with appearances. But I had another idea. Felicia had borrowed a significant sum from Dad for a small business venture, a boutique shop. Dad never charged interest because she was family, but the loan agreement was legally documented, and it remained unpaid. I encouraged Dad to call in that loan, or else take her to court for breach of contract. At first, he hesitated, not wanting a legal battle, but I reminded him how far Felicia went to hurt Robbie. Dad's lawyer sent her a strict demand letter with 30 days to pay up immediately or face litigation. When Felicia received that letter, she panicked, calling me in tears, begging me to tell Dad she'd repay him eventually. I told her I was finished, that she brought this on herself when she locked Robbie in that basement. She tried to twist her motives, saying she never meant harm, but I hung up before she finished her sob story. Over the following days, she spammed me with messages, alternating between apologies and accusations, demanding I fix everything. I blocked her, told Dad what she was doing, and he said he'd handle it through the lawyer. Greg, on his part, confirmed he'd back Dad's claim if it went to court, refusing to cover Felicia's debt. He even contacted me to say Felicia was temporarily staying with a friend because he couldn't tolerate her rants anymore. I let Felicia endure the chaos she'd unleashed and made it known there'd be no forgiveness. With the legal pressure mounting, Felicia's business began to crumble as she scrambled to find funds. Her so-called friends distanced themselves once they realized she was no longer backed by Dad's money. Rumors spread about how she'd endangered her nephew, and people started avoiding her shop out of disgust. Meanwhile, Robbie recovered, though he still had nightmares about being locked in that cold basement. I reassured him that Felicia wouldn't have the chance to hurt him again, and I kept that promise. Dad, for his part, visited Robbie often, showering him with affection and reminding him he was safe now. Felicia's meltdown escalated. She left threatening voicemails on Dad's phone, saying she'd ruin us all if he didn't drop the lawsuit. Instead of backing down, Dad forwarded everything to his lawyer, strengthening the case for malicious intent. Greg took Lily to stay with his parents, denying Felicia access to daughter. Despite the turmoil, I refused to let Felicia's antics consume every part of my life, so I focused on Robbie's well-being. My son was shaken, but therapy sessions helped him process the betrayal and fear he'd experienced. Though I still burned with anger, I made sure Robbie saw me as a stable presence, someone who wouldn't let Felicia's cruelty define us. In the meantime, Dad's lawyer pushed forward with the demand for repayment, refusing any of Felicia's attempts to negotiate a lesser amount. She had promised she could repay eventually, but Dad had lost all faith in her intentions. Rumors circulated that she might try to file for bankruptcy just to avoid paying, but the documents Dad's lawyer had were airtight. There would be no easy escape for her. Greg, disillusioned, reached out occasionally, apologizing again on behalf of his daughter's mother. I never wavered in my stance. One afternoon, I got a call from Greg, who sounded drained. He'd been juggling work, Lily's school schedule, and the emotional fallout of Felicia's actions. He told me Felicia was still lashing out, blaming everyone but herself. She insisted Dad had set her up to fail, that I was orchestrating a massive smear campaign. Greg admitted that for a while he had tried to see if their marriage could be salvaged, but Felicia's raging denial made it impossible. She refused therapy, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, and continued ranting about her so-called victimhood. At that point, Greg said he was preparing to file separation papers. He wanted Lily to grow up in a stable environment away from Felicia's destructive behavior. Hearing this, I felt a grim satisfaction. Actions have consequences, and Felicia had turned her entire world upside down by targeting my innocent child. Dad, who rarely lost his composure, was furious enough to testify against Felicia if it came to that. He'd discovered additional evidence of her misusing prior allowances, funneling money into personal luxuries under the guise of business expenses. I can't say I was shocked. My sister's obsession with appearances always led her to overspend, chasing a lifestyle she couldn't genuinely afford. Now that the trust fund was rescinded and the loan had been called in, she was left scrambling, with no one willing to lend her any support. The last time I spoke to Dad about it, he said Felicia had shown up at his door, screaming threats and insults. He turned her away without hesitation, telling her she was responsible for her own downfall. Although part of me felt the faintest twinge of pity, I remembered Robbie's terrified face and steeled my heart against mercy. Meanwhile, Robbie's therapist encouraged me to talk openly about what happened to assure him he hadn't done anything wrong. We discussed boundaries and how some people, even relatives, can be dangerous if they act out of jealousy or malice. Robbie seemed to understand, but every so often, he'd ask why Felicia hated us so much. My only answer was that sometimes people get lost in their anger and can't see beyond it. That's exactly how I saw Felicia. A woman so blinded by envy that she was willing to lock a sick child in a freezing basement just to feel superior. My father's legal strategy moved forward, unstoppable. The hearing date loomed, and Felicia, lacking funds for a decent attorney, struggled with a bargain basement legal aide who could barely help her. It was a train wreck of her own making, and I watched from a safe distance. The day of the civil hearing, Felicia showed up looking disheveled, not the polished perfectionist I once knew. Dad arrived with his lawyer, who presented detailed records of the unpaid loan and Felicia's explicit responsibility to repay it. Greg submitted a statement confirming her erratic behavior, which further damaged her credibility. I didn't attend in person, but Dad kept me informed. In the end, the judge granted a decision against Felicia, ordering her to repay the entire amount plus legal fees. She had no avenue to fight back effectively. Outside the courtroom, she reportedly exploded at Dad, calling him heartless, blaming me again for orchestrating everything. Dad told her that if she wanted to see heartless, she should think about how she had endangered Robbie's life. From what I heard, Felicia left in tears, but not a single shred of remorse crossed her lips. All the while, Greg stayed resolute in his decision to keep Lily with him. Felicia was furious, but even her lawyer couldn't argue that Greg was doing anything wrong by providing a safe environment for their daughter. After all, Felicia's track record was now marred by emotional instability and potential child endangerment. When she tried to get Lily back, Greg insisted on a supervised visitation schedule, something Felicia viewed as a personal attack. Yet, the court sided with Greg, acknowledging that Lily's well-being was paramount. To my knowledge, Felicia found a dingy apartment after a friend kicked her out for missing rent. She moved from place to place, job to job, her once lavish life reduced to desperate measures. I heard from distant acquaintances that she'd started blaming the entire family for her misery, but no one wanted to listen anymore. In my eyes, everything was unraveling for Felicia exactly as she deserved. She had inflicted fear and harm on my son, and I wasn't about to show her the mercy she never showed us. Dad severed all financial ties, ensuring she couldn't manipulate him for money ever again. Greg kept Lily far away, determined to prevent Felicia's toxic bitterness from poisoning their daughter's mind. The rest of the extended family, upon learning the truth, quietly distanced themselves. Occasionally, an aunt or cousin would ask me if I felt bad for her. Each time, I'd think about Robbie's trembling body, locked away with no warmth. That memory alone was enough to remind me, some lines shouldn't be crossed, and once they are, there's no forgiveness waiting on the other side. Felicia chose her path, and I was simply making sure she faced every consequence of that choice. I remember the first time Robbie smiled after the ordeal, genuinely smiled, and told me he wasn't scared anymore. That was the moment I realized my focus had to be on our future, not just my anger. But that didn't mean I would ever forget or pardon Felicia. I vowed never to let her near my son again. If she wanted to destroy her life through selfish choices, I wouldn't stand in her way. In fact, I made certain to speak to every family member, detailing exactly what happened, providing proof of her malicious intent. She was left with no one to champion her cause. If she wanted a redemption arc, it wouldn't come from me. I wasn't out for her apology. I was out to protect Robbie and see that she felt the repercussions. Turning the other cheek would have signaled weakness, and I refused to be weak. Occasionally, Greg and I talk about what lies ahead. He's not sure if their marriage can or should survive. He's in the process of filing divorce papers, intending to formalize custody arrangements for Lily. I don't blame him. In his shoes, I'd do the same. Our father remains firm that Felicia is no longer part of his estate planning, and he's considering leaving most of his assets in a trust for Robbie and Lily. That's the extent of his compassion. He still cares for his granddaughter's future, but not for Felicia's. As for me, I've moved on emotionally in many ways, though the scars of betrayal linger. Each day, I wake up grateful that Robbie is healthy and safe, that Dad stands by me, and that Felicia's hold on our family has been severed. My life is calmer without her venomous influence. I have no regrets. When people on the outside hear about what happened, some are appalled I didn't try harder to reconcile. My response is simple. I can't reconcile with someone who endangered my son. She locked him away like he was a nuisance, all for her petty need to feel superior. That's not a misunderstanding or a slight quarrel, it's unforgivable. She orchestrated her downfall the moment she turned off that thermostat. Letting her back into our lives would only invite further chaos, and I refuse to let Robbie be exposed to her cruelty again. I realize some might say holding on to revenge is toxic, but I disagree. This isn't me obsessing over payback. It's me ensuring she answers for her actions and remains barred from harming my child in the future. If that's vengeance, so be it. I wear that label without shame. By the time Felicia's court-ordered repayment schedule kicked in, she was already drowning in debt. Dad made it clear he didn't want to see her unless it pertained to legal matters. Greg had full custody of Lily, allowing supervised visits only when Felicia could prove she was stable. She tried once to approach me in public, maybe hoping a scene would make me relent, but I ignored her completely. My father, upon hearing about it, served her another warning through his attorney. She had no place in our lives anymore, no privilege of dragging out her complaints. That forced Felicia into even tighter isolation. While I can't celebrate another person's misery outright, I won't pretend to grieve for her self-inflicted downfall. Each choice she made dug her deeper into this pit. All I did was refuse to throw her a rope. Even now, I keep all communication about Felicia to a minimum, speaking only to confirm court dates or check that Robbie is safe from any contact attempts. Some might consider it cruel, but cruelty was locking a vulnerable child in a cold basement. Cruelty was refusing to apologize or showing even a hint of remorse. I merely followed through, ensuring her aggression had tangible consequences. Dad says he sometimes wonders if he should have been stricter with her growing up. Perhaps, but at this point, it doesn't matter. She's an adult who made a sadistic choice. That decision cost her a family, a stable marriage, and financial security. Am I sorry for that outcome? Not in the slightest. My only regret is that Robbie had to experience such terror. At least now he knows I'll never let anyone get away with hurting him. In the end, Felicia stands as a grim reminder that envy and resentment can corrode a person's entire existence. She threw away everything over a delusional belief that I was somehow stealing Dad's affection and resources. Her twisted sense of entitlement led her to commit a vile act against an innocent child. My father disowned her in every meaningful sense. Greg left her for the sake of their daughter, and our extended relatives keep their distance, repulsed by her cruelty. Some tragedies are self-made, and I won't let her rewrite this story into one of victimhood. She is the villain of her own life. As for me and Robbie, we've moved on to a place of relative peace, surrounded by those who genuinely care. That's the only ending I want. A life free from Felicia's poisonous spite, with no forgiveness granted and no regrets about our firm stand. Dad's decision to remove Felicia from his trust was a turning point, but the final blow was really Greg refusing her access to their child. That was the moment she realized nobody stood in her corner anymore. Yet, even in the face of that isolation, she never offered genuine remorse, never acknowledged the pain she inflicted on Robbie. If she had shown any true regret, maybe Dad might have softened, or Greg might have given their marriage one last chance. But the door to grace was sealed shut by her own refusal to accept responsibility. I don't expect Felicia to change, nor do I waste time hoping she'll find some epiphany. The only thing that matters is that Robbie is safe, our father's legacy is protected, and Felicia is barred from ever harming us again. That's how it should be. Revenge might not erase the memories, but it sure sets boundaries no one dares to cross. I want to reiterate, I don't forgive her, and I never will. Some things can't be undone by apologies, even if she bothered to give one. Watching her lose her privileges, her social standing, and her marriage was the only justice I could accept after seeing Robbie's lips turn blue from cold. No sincere contrition ever came, and I wouldn't have believed it anyway. If that labels me petty, I embrace it wholeheartedly. My son is my priority. Ensuring the person who harmed him suffers real consequences is simply part of protecting him. For all those who think I'm being vindictive, I have one response. Try locking your child in a freezing basement, then see how merciful you feel. My father and Greg felt the same way. Felicia is out of our lives permanently. I'm fine with that, so is Robbie. And that, I believe, is the best revenge imaginable.